In this video, I'm going to go over what is typically referred to as the public policy development cycle. So I'm going to go through the cycle and explain to you what public policy is, and then the steps necessary to develop good public policy. And then toward the end of this, I'm going to give you a couple of demonstrations, a couple of examples of how to identify problems and root causes of problems. When you're trying to develop public policy cycle, when you're trying to develop good public policy using this public policy development cycle. So the policy formulation process. Let's start off with a definition, or at least an explanation of what public policy is. Policy, of course, can be used in many instances, in many environments. You could have, for instance, company policy, private business policy. But when we're talking about public policy, we're talking about policy developed by government at various levels. So for purposes of this class, and public policy is going to include a goal that you want to achieve, and for purposes of this class, to be more specific, a problem that you want to solve. So your goal is the solving of a problem. The second part is to devise a strategy to achieve those goals, and the third part is the implementation of that strategy. Now, when you're looking at goals and strategy, and then an implementation of that strategy, you can think in terms of the three branches, if you wish. It's true that really all three branches are involved in the development of public policy to some degree. But for purposes of our class, I'm kind of leading you on the direction of the legislative branch being the developer of public policy. Although I know that's not the case, but for purposes of exercises for this class, the development of public policy, the setting of the strategy, the identification of goals. So the goals and the strategy to achieve those goals, for purposes of our class, we're focusing on the legislative branch and the committee system. Whether we're talking about Texas government or federal government, it doesn't matter. I'm going to use the same approach in both classes. The goals and the strategy to achieve those goals are going to be pinpointed by the legislative branch, and the strategy would be devised by the legislative branch. And then if you look at the implementation of that strategy, when that would be, for purposes of our class, the executive branch carrying out the strategy, right? So the legislative branch will set the goals and devise the strategy, and with the expectation that the executive branch is going to implement that strategy. After all, the executive branch, they are the hands and feet of government. And then, of course, you have the judicial branch, and sometimes the judicial branch, frankly, is used as the enforcer. So if you have for instance, if your goal is to minimize human trafficking in the country or in the state, then you would certainly use the executive branch, police forces, and prosecutors to implement that strategy. And then eventually, of course, it's going to go before a court, and so the judicial branch can be involved in this process as well. So again, another way to look at this, for purposes of our course, public policy, we're going to focus on three things: targeting a problem to be solved, developing or identifying a strategy to solve that problem, involving government institutions to create, implement, and enforce that strategy. So let's start off with what's classically been referred to as the classic public policy development cycle. So you see Mr. Hulk here, he has a problem and he wants to solve that problem. And so the first thing he has to do then is identify a problem to be solved. Now, in a little while before this video is over, I'm going to include toward the end a demonstration of how to narrowly define the problem. You want to narrowly define the problem. You want to get down to the root causes of the problem. Now, in government, in the world of government, it's not an easy task. It takes researchers, it takes policy analysts to determine what is the real root cause of the problem, and you really have to narrowly define the problem that you want to be solved and what you think are causing the root, or what are the root causes of that problem You see, because if you don't get that first part right, then the strategy that you come up with and the implementation of that strategy, if you don't have the problem correctly identified, then your strategy is going to fail. Okay, you'll discover that later on when you see no results or the problem getting worse. So again, the first part, and I'm going to show you 4 ovals here. These are the 4 parts of the public policy development cycle. So identifying a problem to be solved. Second is really a restatement of what I said in the previous slide. Identify plausible policy solutions. So again, for purposes of exercise, I usually like to steer my students. 1 and 2 here are going to be done by the legislative branch. Now, I know in reality that the executive branch and sometimes even the judicial branch are involved in both 1 and 2. It's just not as cut and dry as perhaps you would like it to be. But for purposes of our class and our exercises, I'm having my students focus on 1 and 2 as being something that the legislative branch does. Okay. Now, the possible policy solutions then, if the legislature is going to come up with a proposed solution, then remember that the executive branch and the judicial branch, they're going to be used to implement that strategy developed by the legislature, and in the case of the judicial branch, to enforce that policy initiated by the legislative branch. But notice it all starts with the legislative branch. All right, so the third part is to implement that selected policy. Now again, for purposes of my class, I like to steer my students toward the implementation part. That's going to be done by the executive branch, and enforcement measures would be done by the judicial branch. The next thing we have to do, and this is very, very important, is you have to evaluate your policy success. Just because you think you have come up with a good plan doesn't necessarily mean that it works. You may actually devise a plan, and it seems to be working, and then a year later the problem is just as bad as it was or worse than it was to begin with. Let me give you an example of what I mean, and I'll try to keep this brief. Back in the 80s and 90s, the United States of America experienced a rise in cocaine consumption. And the decision or the focus of the problem to be solved would be, among other things, cocaine consumption in the U.S., right? That's the problem to be solved. Now, what the federal government focused on was the nation of Colombia, Colombia, and the Colombian drug lords. And it's true that coca grows quite well in Colombia, and it's true that you have some drug lords getting very wealthy in Colombia, and they would grow coca and they would manufacture cocaine illegally, of course, and then it would be imported or trafficked into the U.S. primarily through 3 ports: Miami, in Houston, and New Orleans. So if you look at a map, you can see Colombia. It's to get to Colombia, it's really a water route, the Gulf of Mexico and then the Caribbean, and then you have Colombia, which is on the northern part of South America. So for years, the United States of America, their policy was to go after the Colombian drug lords. And that meant, among other things, working in cooperation with Colombian officials, giving support and aid, giving training to Colombian officials. And we actually saw a decline in the U.S. of consumption, and we saw with many arrests and with a lot of undercover work. We had boots on the ground identifying coca groves, for instance, in Colombia, and then a couple of days later, you'd see this crop duster, this plane, fly over and drop weed killer essentially on those groves. Well, we used a lot of strategies, and we did this in cooperation with the Colombian officials. And in the U.S., we did see a decline in consumption and in arrests related to cocaine. But what happened is, after a few years passed, we began to see arrests and cocaine consumption go up. So what happened? In reality, what happened is all we did was eliminate one producer. So there's a couple things that happened. Number one, Coca grows just fine in other places, not just Colombia. So if you take a look at some of the neighboring countries around Colombia, for instance, Venezuela, coca grows just fine. So some of the drug lords moved their operations out of Colombia, and they began to produce cocaine there. But I'll tell you something else too. Back in those days, you heard about the Mexican drug cartels, but they weren't really as big of an issue to the United States as the Colombian drug lords. But once the U.S. began to focus successfully, by the way, with the aid of the Colombian government, and really putting the squeeze on production of cocaine from Colombia. After a little while, though, we began to see the importance and the fortunes of the Mexican drug cartels increase. So what did we do? We, the United States, essentially eliminated a competitor of the Mexican drug cartels. See, the real problem is demand. The real issue is demand. As long as the U.S. wants to consume cocaine, there will always be a provider, whether it's legal or not. I mean, think about all the manufacturers of trucks in Texas. You have Dodge, you have Toyota, you have Nissan, Chevy, and Ford, just to name a few. What if we put Ford out of business, but the demand for trucks was the same? I mean, what's going to happen? All we've really done is eliminate a competitor, and Chevy and Dodge, Chrysler, Jeep, they're all going to do much better. So when the United States began to focus on Colombia, and primarily on Colombia, it did affect cocaine trafficking and cocaine consumption. But what happened is demand never really changed in the U.S., and that gave rise to, among other things, the Mexican drug cartels to increase. So nowadays, we see Colombia, or rather we see cocaine coming into the U.S., but guess where it's coming? It's not necessarily coming across the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean. It's coming up across the border into California, into Arizona, into New Mexico, and into our own Texas. So again, the strategy back in those days when I was in college and law school was to focus on the supply side. But I would suggest to you the real problem is the demand side. As long as Americans consume or want to consume cocaine, and now of course it's opioids and fentanyl, the synthetic opioid. As long as Americans want to do that, and we are the ones, Americans are the ones, and Western Europeans, and these drug traffickers, the producers, they understand that if you want to make money selling controlled substances, you go two places. You go to the United States of America, and you go to Western Europe. You can become a billionaire. So there's a lot of money at stake. Bottom line here, what I'm trying to share with you is one of the most important things you can do is to honestly evaluate policy success. And I'm sharing that with you to show you that what you think is a good plan and appears to be working at first may not always be the case. Now, I'm going to take you now to a little demonstration, and our focus will be on that first oval, identifying a problem to be solved. And part of the first oval, this is where it all starts, and this is what exercises in this class, whether we're talking about Texas or federal government, are really going to focus on to some degree. So let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean by this. Okay, so these are exercises that you should use on your own and you need to work with this a little bit. So let's just start with this. Let's just say the problem I want government to solve is poverty. Okay, now let me suggest to you that for purposes of this exercise, you need to be much more narrowly defined. Poverty's, I mean, who doesn't want to solve poverty? But if you want to solve a problem and you want to use government to solve that problem, which is really what we're trying to do, you're going to have to get something more narrowly stated. So how about this? Poverty in single mom homes. Now, there's a reason why I choose that demographic, and that is because in the United States of America, if you're going to see poverty, that is where it exists. Let me make it a little bit more narrow. So poverty in teenage or in single mom homes in their 20s. So we're not talking about older single moms. We're not talking about teenagers. We're talking about single mom homes in the 20s. And again, this demographic is where, if you're going to see poverty in the United States or poverty in Texas, this is where it's going. This is where you're going to find it. Let me scroll down. If that's the problem you want to solve, now what I want to do is I want to try to come up with some root causes of that problem. And I want you to notice here that I'm not targeting government as a problem that I want to solve. This is one of the mistakes that students make, and I'll try to give you an example in just a moment. And I'm not targeting government as a root cause of the problem. So let's just throw out some possibilities here. So maybe lack of education. She can't get a well-paying job because she doesn't have a good enough education. She's not competitive. Perhaps there's a lack of family support. Maybe that's the root cause of the problem. Maybe it's a transportation issue. So she's stuck to walking to work, and you all know that having a car, you can get a job 20 miles away, but if you have to walk, you better stick within a mile, right? Especially if you got little ones, and no time or less time because of the children. Okay, let me scroll this up a little bit, right? So notice what I'm looking at here. I'm not targeting anything as a root cause of poverty in single mom homes when the mom is in the 20s that has anything to do with government. Now, the reason why I'm doing that, because for purposes of our exercise, I don't want you to focus on government as the cause of a problem. Listen, I've studied government for years, since the 1980s. I know government can cause a lot of problems, but for purposes of this exercise, I don't want you to focus on government. That's too easy. I want you to think about societal problems that exist that weren't caused by government. You know, if you go back in history, the reason we have government is because there were problems in society that pre-existed government. In other words, government, whatever form it was a solution that people living together in society could not resolve their issues, could not resolve problems. They needed some sort of organized institution to help them. And that organized institution was government, right? So problems exist in society that aren't caused by government. And I want you to notice that these examples here are not caused by government. Again, it's real easy in 2023 to say, look, the reason we have this problem is because government. Government doesn't do this, government doesn't do that, government doesn't do that over there. But that's not what I want you to do here. I want you to go outside of government for this exercise, okay? And again, all of these, and you can go another direction here and think outside the box. Let's see, the disintegration of the traditional family. Now, this is a direction that a lot of folks feel uncomfortable going. But if you want to identify a real root cause of a problem, you might want to consider this. Even if you decide that that's not something that you want to target to try to fix, but I'm not saying you shouldn't, at least identify it. Otherwise, you're going to be walking through time and space, purposely blinding yourself or purposely keeping yourself blind to a real cause of a problem. Okay, so notice again that I didn't, how narrowly I stated this, and the root causes have nothing whatsoever to do with government. So whenever you start coming up with solutions, you're going to have to identify those root causes. So let's look at another problem. So let's just say obesity. The problem I want to solve is obesity. How about in males? Or how about we say boys, age 10 to 12, or maybe even narrow it down. I'm gonna pick on my my own heritage. So I have Asian, Hispanic, and Anglo blood in me. So let's say here Asian heritage. Okay, my father was an immigrant for the Philippine Islands. So notice how narrow this demographic is. So obesity in boys, age 10 to 12, of Asian heritage. Okay, that is the problem I want to solve. Now, there could be all kinds of root causes for this problem. So let's just give this some thought here. Parents, uneducated regarding a diet. Maybe there are budget issues. You all know that I can go to H-E-B and I can spend $10 and get all kinds of potatoes, bread, and rice and beans. But if you go to the lean meat section, you may only be able to buy maybe half of a nice cut, right? So maybe it's budget issues. Maybe the family sits around and plays video games or stays inside all the time. Whatever the case may be, improper role models. So you guys see where I'm looking, where I'm going with this, all right? So there are all kinds of directions you can go. Now that I've shown you how to identify root causes, I'm going to give you some don'ts, okay? So let me give you some examples of some don'ts. Don't do this. The problem I want to solve is healthcare. Well, the problem with this problem that's stated is healthcare is actually a good thing, okay? So maybe it's, you need to restate this. Healthcare is not the problem you want to solve, it's the lack of healthcare. You can even narrow it down for, okay, you can narrow it down. Our immigrants from Mexico, right? You can make it even narrower, okay? So again, make sure that you're stating your problem as a real problem. So that would be improperly stated. Here's another one. The problem I want government to solve is gun control, okay? Look, I understand probably where the student is going, but you'd be surprised how oftentimes I see this. But think about this. Gun control, the control of guns, is not the problem. It's actually policy. And I don't want you to target current government policy or practice. Our job here is not to critique what government is or is not doing. That is saved for another exercise, right? But that's not what we're doing here. I think where the student would want to go with this is something like this: gun violence in high school, or gun violence in elementary schools, right? So do you all see the difference here? This is the problem I want to solve. And then the possible root causes, you'll have to come up with those. I'm not going to go there. All right, so another common problem that I see is students, when they identify the problem to be solved and the root causes, they'll want to go to education. And you can go to education if you want to, but just keep this in mind, that in Texas, high schools and schools in general are forms of local government. I don't know if you knew that or not, but your independent school districts in Texas, just as an example, they are taxing entities. They can tax you. That's a power that government has. And some of them are actually going to have their own police forces. That's a power the government has. So you don't want to target a problem to be solved that is identifying what you don't like about what goes on in the schools, right? And possible root causes of the problem. Again, you don't want to identify something that government should be doing and isn't doing, or perhaps they're doing and isn't, and in your opinion, isn't doing correctly. Okay, so look for exercises that are related to this, and we're going to call it quits there.